just the disparity in numbers really drove the military to try to have a technological advantage. And so better fighter aircraft, better tanks, better whatever. His argument explicitly was that militaries get better when they are separated from society. And on that too, the evidence shows that he was just dead wrong. I can tell you, I would much rather have a Sherman that I was supporting than a lot of the German tanks.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Times Radio History Myth-Busting. I'm James Hanson. Every episode we choose a moment from history or an historical figure, and I sit down with one of our experts to talk through some things that people get wrong, and we'll also cover a few things you might not know. Today it's the turn of one of the most powerful forces in the world and throughout 20th century history, the US military. Joining me today for the first time on the channel from the US, we're delighted to have J.P. Clark, historian and Associate Professor of Strategy at the US Army War College. J.P., welcome to Times Radio History.
Delighted to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Now, something that comes up quite a lot when we talk about myths and historical myths is just where they come from. Now, the US military obviously is such a vast historical subject. Do you think it's almost inevitable that over the years certain myths will develop?
There certainly is, and I think that part of the problem tends to be, and certainly none of the viewers that you have would fall into this trap, but amongst the general public and even amongst practitioners, we tend to assume that the present moment is really the way it has always been. And I think we're going to hit this as we go through into some of these different myths. While it might be true today, or at least partly true today, some of these myths we assume, we kind of then reverse engineer the present into the past, and then that leads to these myths coming up, and sometimes with some pretty serious consequences if we're making bad choices about the use of force in war, because that's a fairly important and serious topic. And I think that we'll kind of get into some of those today, where we just assume that this has ever been thus, so to speak.
Well, let's get into your 5 myths that you've chosen for us about the US military. First and foremost, let's start with number 1, and this is a big one. This is the idea that the US military has always used overwhelming force. Is that true?
No, it's not, and as per the theme of the show. But to the previous point, this is a great example of it, and a lot of this comes out of the very recent past, looking back into, I think, Desert Storm, and then you also had in the 1980s, and then into the early 1980s, either the Secretary of Defense Weinberger doctrine, or sometimes called the Powell doctrine, off of Chairman Powell when he was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And basically both of those gentlemen said that when we go to war as the United States, then we should make sure that we do it with overwhelming force. We should make sure that we have a clear goal and that we go home as quickly as possible. And the fact that we even have to state that kind of shows that it hasn't always been the case that the U.S. has used overwhelming force. Weinberger and Powell were primarily looking at Vietnam. They were both of that generation, and so they were reacting to that. But just more generally, this kind of comes into a basic truth, and this doesn't necessarily need to apply only to the U.S. Statesmen, politicians decide when a state is going to go to war, and it's very unpopular usually to say that this is going to be extremely long, it's going to be extremely complex, it's going to be extremely bloody, it's going to take a long time. And so there is a built-in pressure for politicians and statesmen to understate how expensive a war is going to be, to underestimate how expensive a war is going to be. We saw this actually then in 2003 with Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld and some of the people who were surrounding him. Hey, this is going to be easy. Why can't we just do it with 1 or 2 divisions? We don't need all of these forces. The very famous argument with General Shinseki, who was the chief of staff of the Army at the time. And that was not a one-off. That's just something that the governments tend to do to want to minimize the cost of war ahead of time. And then once they're in a war, wars are expensive. They fall heavily upon a population, both in terms of the economic and resource extraction, the sacrifices that publics have to make, and then also obviously the blood sacrifice in terms of the loss of sons and now daughters as well. And so there's always this, the governments will tend to want to try to minimize the cost of war. That has been true throughout American history, that even though perhaps at various points, the United States, might have been the richest country in the world, later on, not necessarily in the early days. But politicians and statesmen have always tried to get away with as little as possible. And that has led to a lot of shoestring affairs throughout American history, all the way from the War of 1812 up until just the recent past. We're trying to get by with as few troops as possible.
So, if not overwhelming force, then how would you describe the US military's modus operandi? Or is that so subjective depending on which era we're talking about?
That's a great question. And I think one of the other myths, we'll kind of get into it, and we can almost talk about how the country wants to fight. And that is, something that is up to the civilian policymakers in our system, where they're trying to give as little to the military as possible to prosecute the war. And then there's also how the military chooses to fight the war. And at points, as I think we'll talk about here pretty soon, that has been a very technological, or at least industrial heavy approach, but not always in that case either.
And what about the US's use of deterrence, which is a far less sexy military tactic, but is incredibly important?
Well, and so there's two interesting aspects of deterrence, and one of the things that I teach in the Army War Colleges is theory, and so we go deep into deterrence theory. And when we talk about with nuclear weapons, then obviously the whole aspect there is that the overwhelming destruction that they can unleash is what causes the deterrence to happen. In the other cases of conventional deterrence, and this is currently actually our national defense strategy as we speak, is talks about integrated deterrence in terms of states like Russia and China, but even going back into if we talk about World War II and trying to deter Japan from expanding in 1939, 1940, then that time frame, the conventional deterrence, that typically the reason why we are there in that position where we're trying to deter somebody is that we understand that the war will be long and costly. This gets into another of the myths that is coming up. And so to avoid that much more costly war, we hope that we can kind of get by. Sometimes it's a little bit more of a bluff because we don't necessarily want to spend the money. And so that then becomes another case that shows the same aspect of wars are expensive, and countries rightly don't always necessarily want to pay that bill.
Well, let's come on now to your myth number 2 about the US military. And this looks at the military between the 19th and the 20th centuries. JP, just how did the US become the dominant military force of the 20th century?
Okay, thank you. And one of the major myth that's kind of involved here is and it comes from Samuel Huntington, who is a very famous political scientist at Harvard. And as we talk about what created the 20th century, professional American military ethos, which underpins a lot of what's going to happen later on in the 20th century, Huntington said that essentially after the Civil War, the Army was locked away. It was far away from society, isolated on the frontier. Imagine, some of your favorite John Wayne movies, perhaps, and then desolate Fort Apache. And essentially, when the military was locked away, that isolation from civilian society gave room for the modern military professionalism that we have today, and that we share with a lot of other allies and partners around the world. In terms of the factual history, Huntington was just wrong. The Army actually was not isolated at all. There's a lot of things that were going on other than just the frontier, and depending upon what time period you're talking about and what definitions we wanted to use, it's fair to say that less than half of the Army was ever involved in anything like the kind of the desolate frontier post. And certainly if you talk about the officer corps, which is what Huntington was talking about, he didn't really care a whole lot about the rank and file. Even more, we talk about inevitably there's some staff officers in Washington, D.C., various headquarters throughout the country, which were in big cities like Chicago and Los Angeles. You also have, Corps of Engineers is involved in big cities. And so the physical isolation was not there, but really the reason why this is a more important discussion, because how isolated the U.S. Army was in the 1880s and 1890s is a question of really only of interest to historians who are deep into it, like myself. Huntington, the more important aspect was he's arguing that there was a mental separation, a separation in spirit from society. And his argument explicitly was that militaries get better when they are separated from society. And on that, too, the evidence shows that he was just dead wrong. In fact, when we have, and this is the period in within the American periodization, we call it the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. And this was the era of reform, and all sorts of aspects coming out. And so everything from medical, the founding of the American Medical Association, the American Bar Association, in the legal, realm. All of those were being founded at the time. The officers were explicitly looking at it. The place where I currently work, the Army War College, that was also founded at this time in response and aping what was going on in civilian society. And this is just the professionalization and standardization of professions across the way. And that's what drove it. And so whether that is always the case, and whether, civilian ideas always make the military better, is up for a debate. But certainly in the case that Huntington was looking at, it was the exact opposite. Civilian ideas coming into the military made it much better. And I should say, as I mentioned, the Army War College, the standard disclaimer that we have to give, and that all of these ideas are my own, not that of the Army War College, the Army, or the Department of Defense. And so sorry for that pause, but the lawyers make us do that. So,
so I'm guessing, JP, you would put the increased professionalism of the US military around the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries down to scientific advancements, technological advancements, medical advancements.
Absolutely. These were in terms of, and it did help that actually the advancements themselves, when we talk about, and then I would say that the Army actually was a part of the medical advancement in terms of, as we were combating yellow fever in Cuba. And so Army doctors were the ones who figured out the mosquitoes were the vectors for that. But more generally, just drawing on how do these other professions, how do the sciences, how do the doctors, how do the lawyers, how do all these professions organize themselves, and then taking that and applying it to the military, so that because it displaces the old gentleman, amateur idea of officership. And as I had said earlier on, war is far too serious and far too complex to just assume that you show up, and if you're the right sort of chap, that everything else will follow. That's very dangerous, and on-the-job training is never the way that we want to learn when it comes to war.
Just before we move on, if you had to describe the state of the US military, let's say in the latter part of the 19th century, how would you sum it up?
So the building blocks were being put into place for the later expansion, and certainly throughout most of the latter part of the 19th century, the entire U.S. Army, active Army, I should say, there was a National Guard at that time, only had 27,000 soldiers. Where right now there's a lot of concern that, and we're about ready to go down to 465,000 soldiers in the active component. So clearly, leaps away in terms of the size. But one of the elements that a lot of the professional underpinnings that we still use today, and of course, people can debate about how well the American military has performed and whatever recent conflict you want to put out. But I don't think that any of it would have been better with simply we'll show up and then we'll kind of nug through it because we're gentlemen and have the right sort of character. And so the underpinnings, the Army War College, the Naval War College, the beginning of actually of realistic field training, we take it for granted today that, of course, you'd want to go out and you'd want to, to train for war. But under this previous kind of notion of warfare, it actually was considered uh, prejudicial and counterproductive to go out and try to replicate war and peace, because they said if you don't have danger, if you don't have the bullets flying, you actually are learning false lessons. And so it was all about just kind of taking it easy, not working too hard of a duty day, and then when the war started, we'll all start figuring it out then. And it was at this period that went away. It started concentrating on things like massive mobilization exercises, even if there are maps. And so one good example, George C. Marshall, who's kind of considered the architect of victory in World War II, it was during this period and the schools that were set up during this time that even though the army was small, he was learning how to control armies of vast size. He did it as a colonel in World War I as a staff officer and planner. And then as the Army Chief of Staff in World War II, he was managing a force of several million.
Okay, let's move on to your third myth now. And this is about how the US conducts conflicts. Has it always favored technological warfare?
Right. And this goes into kind of your earlier question. Since the 1970s, the U.S. military has really been focused, and this kind of comes into just trying to figure out the problem of defending Germany and Western Europe against the Soviets without having to resort to nuclear weapons, whether tactical or whether the strategic. And that just the disparity in numbers really drove the military to try to have a technological advantage. And so better fighter aircraft, better tanks, better whatever. And so there would, even though there was going to be higher numbers on the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet side, superior kit would overcome the odds there. And that's been since the 1970s, and that's continued to be the kind of the mode that the U.S. military tries to use to offset some of the lack of numbers that we think we have, at least according to what are the requirements out there in the world. Obviously, larger than a lot of other militaries, just in absolute terms. Before that, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, you had a very different kind of approach where it wasn't going for the best kit. And you think about the great example of this is kind of like a Sherman tank versus a Panther or a Tiger, where the Germans were the ones who were trying to rely upon having more advanced equipment, Messerschmitt 262 jets, all of that, and we were just putting out a technological solution, but it was the technology of mass. And so, and rather than technological superiority, it was industrial superiority. And we saw this also then in Korea, of just kind of using firepower rather than just sheer manpower to overcome the adversary. And this is also the same thing that you see in Vietnam of let's just kind of apply more firepower. There's a natural assumption that this has always been the American way, and even in the 19th century, it was actually the Brits who came up with the idea of Yankee ingenuity and all of these technological adaptations. You didn't really see that in the 19th century in terms of the army. That was kind of true for most of the armies. One of the criticisms of Clausewitz is that he kind of ignored technology. But there was a long period where there was not a lot of technological change in warfare, and it's certainly not enough that any state was suddenly going to be able to go up the league tables because it had invented some sort of new technology. There were constant improvements, but they weren't the kind that was going to give one state an advantage over the other.
I suppose, though, it's an age-old military debate, isn't it? I don't know what side you come down on it. How important is military technology and weaponry, and how important are just the number of boots you can put on the ground?
Right, and also and who's filling those boots, and
the training,
and how disciplined. And we're seeing this today in a lot of the discussions about AI driven decision making versus human decision making, and there's a understandable, and as you just said, there's a understandable deep felt need to say, hey, I can do this better than a machine. Nobody wants to be second fiddle, at least within something like the infantry. Maybe pilots and sailors have a slightly different relationship to their machine. But certainly, the U.S. Army of World War I was not all about the technology.
Just to pick out one thing you mentioned earlier on, you mentioned the Sherman tanks during World War II. Do you think they got an unnecessarily bad reputation?
Ooh, so I started off my career as a tank officer, and I really like being in an M1 tank when I know that I have the baddest vehicle that goes out around the battlefield. Uh, I think that the one of the problems with the Sherman obviously is the kind of fuel that it was using, and so there's something horrific about the gasoline fire that certainly is demoralizing for tank crews. The other aspect, and what I currently teach right now, is I teach our new Army strategists who are just coming into the career field, and this is one of the kind of examples we give. Just last week, I was out at Gettysburg with a group in a very similar sort of discussion, actually, in terms of should you have rifled muskets or should you have, breech loading, carbines, repeaters, and anytime you take a look at a military system, it's not simply, a one-on-one. Would a Sherman be able to, defeat a Panther? But also, you have to look at the whole military system. Can you keep it running? Can it be resupplied? How many can you make so that you then have a massive amount versus just a few exquisite exquisite systems? And in all of those calculations, there was a lot of consistency in terms of the ordnance department, in terms of how we were going to crank things out. Same thing with the Navy Department in terms of their ships, and so having fewer standardized classes, I think that as a system, I think that the Sherman tank was very well suited to what the strategic situation was for the Allies, and obviously British and Soviet crews were using them as well. And I think that actually the Germans, and this was our discussion yesterday of in our class about the relationship between the economy and war. The Germans actually made some pretty bad decisions, both in terms of individual designs, but then also having so many designs that they weren't able to keep them maintained. Because I have also spent time as a battalion maintenance officer for a tank battalion, and I can tell you, I would much rather have a Sherman that I was supporting than a lot of the German tanks.
That's a really interesting point. Just before we move on to myth number 4 about the US military, if there's one piece of American military technology that you think was the most significant technological development, what would you say it is? I mean, a lot of people would instinctively go, well, it's got to be the atomic bomb.
There's the interesting aspect where Bernard Brodie, who had been doing Navy strategy, for throughout World War II, the morning after Hiroshima, he says everything I've learned is now now no longer applicable, and now I have to master this new world. And this gets to your earlier question about deterrence, and the problem is you don't really ever know that deterrence has happened. You might think, okay, it's been great that we've had none of these wars. Certainly, they didn't incentivize anybody to have a war, but would we have had it without? And currently it's interesting watching Putin trying to get a lot of play out of his nuclear arsenal. And there was just an article last week in I think it was the Wall Street Journal talking about just like the diminishing power of the threat of nuclear weapons. So that definitely has been huge, but boy, the threat is so large that it sometimes becomes difficult to actually use it in a credible fashion, and this has spawned a whole lot of theory and many books that the students and I on every day are trying to wrestle through it, and we haven't quite got there. So I guess I don't have a good answer for you. That's pat.
No, but it's a really good point you raise about deterrence. I mean, no US president ever gets credit for a war that didn't happen, even if their decisions helped avoid these wars. So it's a really interesting point you raise. Let's move on to myth number 4 about the US military. Now, we've already talked quite a lot about the Pacific War on this channel. And that's really the topic of this fourth myth. And this is the idea that the US military was surprised somehow by the Japanese success in World War II. Were they surprised?
No, and there's you can see exactly why this myth would kind of take root, because obviously there was a tactical surprise at Pearl Harbor, although even then, many of your viewers will know that there was predictions about attack, and there was knowledge that that there could be an air attack on Pearl Harbor. And then when you also combine this with the attack on the Philippines that begins in December 1941, continues into 1942 before it finally falls. And this is at the same time that there's all the other campaigns, Singapore, whatnot. And it was a real shock to the American public that the Japanese, and so there was definitely some racial thinking, and how could these Asians overcome us? We're the great American people, and so there was a lot of overconfidence in the general public. You also have a certain amount where the Japanese successes throughout 1941, early 1942, were just so staggering that you would assume that the military had been surprised and had not been ready for it. But really, from 1906 was the first war scare with Japan that was based off of there was some racist legislation in the United States and California. The San Francisco School Board, of all bodies, had started creating a war scare. And at that point, when we have Theodore Roosevelt, not Franklin, Theodore Roosevelt is in the White House. He was acutely aware that the Philippines were vulnerable to Japan, which wasn't quite as obviously wasn't as big in terms of population, didn't have the overall economy, but they just finished the Russo-Japanese War and had a very large and capable military at that point. And in 1915, there was an Army War College study that predicted where the main Japanese landing was going to happen in 1941. So this is 1915. They predict where the Japanese are going to land, and to an accuracy within 2 days, how long it would take the Japanese to make their way into Manila, because that's just kind of military physics. It's a set distance. We know that the terrain is like. We know what march, rates of march are over that kind of terrain. And back to the first myth. Even though the U.S. had this military, outpost, there was never the political will to actually build up the forces there to be big enough to deter, to which would have been your follow-up, to the first myth of the overwhelming aspect. And so it was well known. One of the chief tacticians before the war, and one of the guys who came up with the infantry will always overcome mantra. He said, actually, it's to save the Filipino people the heartache of invasion. It's hopeless in terms of the military situation from the U.S. defender standpoint. He goes, we should just kind of minimize our presence, because there's no way that we're going to be able to defend the Philippines against the Japanese.
Well, there we go. 4 myths down, 1 to go. Let's come on to myth number 5 about the US military. And this brings us on to the Vietnam War. Just clear up for us, JP, if you can. What was life like for the military after the conflict? There is this sense that there was a stigma almost attached to being a Vietnam veteran. Is that true?
Yes. Yeah. So the main myth is that this was unusually traumatic for the military. And one of a recent book by a good friend of mine, Brian Lynn, called Real Soldiering, talks about all of the different periods of history afterwards. And the case that Brian makes is it wasn't just Vietnam where it was miserable, because when you have a war, for the reasons that we kind of laid out on the first myth, the Army doesn't have what it needs at the beginning, or I should say the military writ large. It ramps up, you bring in all of these people, creates a lot of disruption. And then when the war's done, you have to figure out, all right, so these people have fought for their country. Some of them want to stay in, many want to get out. For those who are staying in, on what terms do we let them continue on in the post-war military as it's drawing down? And so there was a lot of certainly there was a lot of turmoil after Vietnam, but the point is, and that actually has always been the case when you have organizations going through so much churn. The other aspect that is kind of interesting, and I think it also gets to the second kind of aspect of your question, but it's not just what's daily life like and what there's an organization that is going through a massive downsizing. When you have a lot of redundancies, that's going to be difficult for any organization. But then also the psychological adjustment, and it tends to be that the Army has poor expectations and too high, too ambitious expectations for how things are going to be after the war is done, and there's a lot of turmoil and depression kind of within the psychology of the Army, even after victorious wars. And he points this out that this occurred after World War I, World War II, and so Vietnam, there is a little bit extra in terms of the stigma of defeat, but this as a prod to kind of productive learning going forward isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it wasn't that the Vietnam was the only one where if you were a regular soldier 3 or 4 or 5 years after the war, you're questioning whether you need to get a new career after Vietnam, but not of all the other wars. Wars disrupt militaries, and that's what happens.
Because you do get this idea sometimes that soldiers who'd served in Vietnam were spat at in the streets, say, and disrespected. Is that just a fiction from Hollywood movies?
I know you've had Bill Allison on, and so there certainly was. He'd be a better person to talk about this. There was some aspect. The war was deeply divisive within American society. There's no doubt about that. But there was two sides to that coin, and the average American, service member's experience, the sense that I have gotten is actually probably it was more just the dislocation of coming home after, and reintegrating into society, which is something that we've actually seen with Iraq and Afghanistan as well, where plenty of yellow ribbons around and support our troops. The psychological aspect of coming home to a society that where not everybody is at war, that's probably much more difficult than the overt attacks on people.
Well, JP, you have comprehensively busted those myths about the US military. Thank you so much. Before we go, we always like to end the show by hearing one true fact that a lot of people may not know. What have you got for us?
So, contrary to belief, the U.S. Army actually conducted more amphibious operations in World War II than the Marine Corps. The Marine Corps obviously is defined by its amphibious nature and its relationship to the Navy, and so they had plenty of hard fighting and plenty of amphibious operations. But during World War II, the Army was simply much bigger. And in Europe, we think about North Africa, D-Day, all of those. Obviously, those were Army affairs. But even in the Pacific, when you have invasions of New Guinea, Philippines, Okinawa, all of those had significant Army role as well. And one fact that just kind of, I think, underscores just how many operations were being conducted in the southern Philippines in early 1945 for a span of a couple of weeks. There actually was a major Army or a Army amphibious operation every day and a half for a period of several weeks as they were doing, hopping around various islands in the southern Philippines, which just shows just the scale of World War II, not necessarily, denigrating it to an extent the Marine Corps, which did have plenty of amphibious operations on its own.
JP Clark, this has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Well, don't forget, we'll be back very soon busting some more myths. And if there's anything you want to see deconstructed, let us know in the comments. And remember to like this video, share and subscribe to our channel, Times Radio History. We'll see you next time. Goodbye.